Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for American Progress. We will begin our program shortly, so please find a seat and silence all cell phones. During our question and answer period, if you have a question, please raise your hand. And if you are chosen, state your name and affiliation before asking a brief question. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Christy Goldfuss. I'm the Senior Vice President for Energy and Environment Policy here at CAP. Earlier this year, there was a collective sigh of relief when Congress passed a bipartisan bill that continued to fund science and specifically climate science programs across the government. Unfortunately, today's discussion and CAP's Burning the Data report, researched and written by Luke Bassett, Christina Costa, and Leah Catania, will show that simply appropriating the dollars just isn't enough. The systematic elimination of science and scientists from agencies across the federal government means the journey to protect data and ensure that programs continue to operate as intended has just begun. There is a lack of transparency in the budgeting process that will make this an extraordinary challenge for Congress and those compelled to protect the data necessary to protect the planet. This is really a call to action to all of you. With every day that passes, more Americans and indeed more people around the world see the impacts of climate change firsthand. We can't afford to lose the data and information that will tell us the best ways to respond and how to help the world allocate precious resources for those who need them most. The Trump administration has repeatedly indicated its disdain for science, especially climate science. Our guests today will tell their stories of using federal climate and energy data and research, of defending and funding for those programs, and of championing scientific integrity in policymaking. This discussion could not be more important. So let me start by introducing one of the leaders who's really taken up the charge in defending science. To begin our discussion today, I would like to introduce Representative Paul Tonko, who represents New York's 20th Congressional District and serves as a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and ranking member on its Subcommittee on Environment. In this role, Representative Tonko has been a strident voice, calling for more transparency and less interference from the Trump administration in science-based policymaking. Beyond calling for greater oversight at federal science agencies, Representative Tonko has also sponsored the Scientific Integrity Act, which calls for federal agencies to develop and enforce policies that ensure that scientific conclusions are not made based on political decision-making. Given all this, I hope you share my excitement and interest in hearing his perspective, and please welcome to the podium. Welcome to CAP.
Thank you, Christy Goldfuss, for your kind invitation and welcome. And thank you for the leadership as it relates to very important segments of our policy making and our economy. And to John Podesta and the entire Center for American Progress effort, thank you for keeping us so on track with what I think is the best course to follow for building the economy and providing fairness for all in this country. So I thank you as a Center for American Progress for inviting me here today to join what is a distinguished group that has done so much to advance thoughtful, clean energy and climate policy in our country. Make no mistake, we are witnessing serious, concerted attacks on science and expertise within the federal government. This administration has made a point to dismiss and even directly undermine the role of science in policy making. Allowing science to be ignored and misused will significantly inhibit our ability to address urgent multi-generational or existential threats. I cannot overstate how important it was to have a real leader and expert in Secretary Moniz. Thank you, Secretary. His involvement with the Iran nuclear negotiations speaks more forcefully as we go forward. As we continue a dialogue with North Korea, we need to ask, who has the President's ear? It certainly is not a director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, a position that has remained vacant for some 18 months. Today, we are here to discuss another big global challenge that also draws on a foundation of scientific and diplomatic expertise, climate change and the transition to a clean energy future. I am still baffled that I need to say this, but the federal employees that work on these issues are driven first and foremost by data. Our Environmental Protection Agency is fundamentally a science agency. Its staffers are focused on how we can make evidence-based decisions to protect public health and our environment. So I am deeply concerned by the attitude of the Trump administration to dismiss not only the scientists, engineers, and experts that work at these agencies, but to reject even the scientific process itself. These trends are worrying, and I am grateful for this opportunity to share some of the ways I think we can combat them and reinforce standards for scientific integrity throughout each and every of our federal agencies. When we consider multi-generational challenges, including the changing climate and shifts in our energy sector, we need to rely on long-term and consistent data tracking. I am thankful for the work of outside groups, such as Secretary Moniz's Energy Futures Initiative and NRDC, that are continuing to update DOE reports, including the Energy Jobs Census and Revolution Now, which looked at cost reductions in clean energy technologies. But tracking climate and emissions data is beyond what one single organization can do. We need federal leadership, but this administration refuses to even accept the gripping realities of climate change. They call it climate skepticism. That is a misnomer. Skepticism is at the heart of the scientific method, but denial in the face of overwhelming scientific consensus is irresponsible and downright dangerous. The fourth National Climate Assessment Climate Science Special Report was released by the administration without fanfare, and it is clear they are not taking its evidence-driven conclusions seriously. That Americans are already feeling the impacts of climate change in their daily lives. I do not think I need to convince anyone in this room of the consequences of climate change. Sea levels are rising, and hurricanes and wildfires are already more severe and more frequent. And I can assure you that the Chinese government does not believe climate change is a hoax. Every 5 weeks, 9,500 new electric buses are being deployed in China, the equivalent of London's bus fleet. China is seriously grappling with the effects of climate change and air pollution and implementing solutions. And they stand to benefit from their serious response. By contrast, rather than engaging in an honest debate about potential climate solutions and the investments necessary to make America the global leader in clean energy, this administration has shown a willingness, if not eagerness, to ignore evidence and stand in the way of solutions when they do not conform to a certain politics or worldview. And more often than not, they do this over the objections of federal employees, leading outside experts, and the international community. They have proposed massive budget cuts to climate and clean energy research and are floating regulatory proposals based on little to no supporting data. President Trump even refused to attend meetings at the G7 summit if they had anything to do with climate change. This departure from science and common sense has very real consequences for our nation's ability to respond to climate change. Funding of the vast majority of university research, including climate research, comes from federal dollars. The restriction or reduction of those funds could devastate the university research system. This research is a vital resource for many entities, both in and out of the federal government. International assessments like the IPCC would be weakened without the United States' data and financial support. And state and local governments rely on federal agencies for guidance on climate mitigation and certainly adaptation. One recent example is a paper from the NOAA scientists which determined hurricanes are now moving more slowly and causing more damage than ever before. This paper used NOAA data to show this trend between 1949 and 2016, an insight that would have been impossible without long-term, multi-decade data sets. During that time, hurricanes have slowed 10% and now carry a greater risk of storm surges. This has important policy implications for the United States disaster planning moving forward. But we could lose the ability to see these very climate changes if we stop funding this very essential research, or if there are gaps in these data sets, or if NOAA or NASA or DOE or EPA stop collecting critical Earth science and emissions data, or if political appointees are allowed to interfere in the scientific process. I am grateful that the Center for American Progress is tracking capital funding trends in this new Burning the Data report. But we should also discuss the administration's anti-science attitude, which has shown up in some other subtler but still very harmful ways. These include censorship of federal scientists, prohibiting them from presenting their work publicly, or even from using words like science-based and evidence-based, and scrubbing federal websites of valuable climate information. Earlier this year, the Environment Data and Governance Initiative found that since the start of the Trump administration, EPA has removed more than 200 climate web pages created to help state, local, and tribal governments prepare for, adapt to, and mitigate the harms of climate change. If scientists feel they cannot do their work in the light of day, or must use confusing phrases to obscure the implications of their research, the results are far less likely to achieve their purpose of protecting and informing the public, media, and, of course, policymakers. From my vantage point in Congress, I have seen these attacks on science and EPA happening very directly. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt has directed a campaign to roll back numerous regulatory actions from the previous administration, including those focused on reducing greenhouse gas pollution with little or no basis in evidence to refute the science that shaped those given rules. The proposed repeal of the Clean Power Plan has been partially based on a reconsideration of its cost-benefit analysis that is completely unjustified. Beyond the obvious climate benefits, Administrator Pruitt has not even attempted to engage with the rule's health benefits, reductions in pollution that are estimated to prevent 3,600 premature deaths, 90,000 asthma attacks in children, and some 300,000 missed school and work days each year. These are real benefits that would make our country healthier and our economy more productive. Administrator Pruitt is seeking to prevent these types of health benefits from being considered in EPA rulemaking, a fact that I will get back to in a moment. EPA political leaders have gone after other climate protections, such as reopening the final determination for greenhouse gas standards for light-duty vehicles. Again, this was done without any serious effort to refute the robust technical assessment behind it that accounted for significant public health and climate benefits. Their explanation did not even mention the word pollution, let alone include any rigorous analysis. EPA has also proposed repealing a rule on polluting heavy-duty trucks, known as glider kits, citing a study commissioned by the company which would benefit most from the rule change. The fact that this industry-funded study was incongruent with EPA's previous scientific findings has not stopped the agency from considering this rollback. These rules are critical to America's climate action plan. All are slated to be undone without any consideration for the rigorous science that went into their given development. Hopefully, by now you are sensing a theme. This administration is working to undermine federal climate action by ignoring, covering up, or directly targeting the science that supports it. EPA's Science Advisory Board voted recently to review these and other decisions. I expect these independent advisors will ultimately rebuke the administrator's mistreatment of science in rulemaking. Sadly, these anti-science efforts even go beyond Administrator Pruitt's attempted regulatory rollback. I mentioned that the EPA administrator is trying to block consideration of health impacts as part of the agency's rulemaking process. The recently proposed selective science policy would severely limit the types of research that EPA could take into account when developing policies. This is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to block or restrict research that supports environmental and public health protections. The argument goes that all underlying data used in rulemaking should be publicly available. However, many studies, including epidemiological research, rely on personal medical data. As a result, Administrator Pruitt's selective science policy could exclude these health studies entirely from EPA rulemaking. The administrator has realized that his approach could hurt regulated industries too, since many EPA chemical reviews rely on confidential business information that would need to be disclosed. To get around this, the administrator would have complete discretion to exempt studies from this transparency standard, which is why we refer to it as selective science. I mentioned earlier that Clean Power Plan's health benefits, which were partially calculated by landmark clean air studies like the Harvard Six-City study, opponents of Clean Air Act protections would like nothing more than to see those types of studies excluded from the EPA reviews. Make no mistake, there will be long-term consequences if these actions go unchecked. The brain drain of American scientists has already begun, with hundreds of scientists leaving federal service, and in some cases, our country, with no plan to replace them. 10 years ago, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper used similar tactics to hamstring science in the government, such as gag orders of scientists, keeping scientists from presenting their results, and limiting access to journalists. The Trump administration is taking this strategy to the nth degree. It was only when the scientific community stood together, engaged the public in meaningful ways, and spoke up to defend their work and fight back that tide was turned back. Still, the impacts of the Harper administration's action are still being felt. So what can be done? Well, first, we must continue to talk about the centrality of science in policymaking and the consequences of undermining it. We need the public to recognize that this administration does not respect science or expertise and will continue to dismiss its role in policymaking and sideline qualified federal employees. Many scientists have expressed a desire to stay above the political fray and avoid politicizing their work. But we need scientists to speak out and speak out now. We saw thousands of people in communities around the country rally for the March for Science. The energy is definitely out there. And when people learn that science that supports vital protections for our clean air, our water, and climate being ignored, they respond. We need to keep delivering that message loud and clear. In the meantime, I hope Congress will continue to fund many of these important research programs, especially climate research, but also energy innovation, including basic science, development and demonstration, and support for commercialization. We need a director of OSTP that actually cares about the treatment of science throughout the federal government. We need to push back on the ongoing attacks on science advisory boards across the government. These are independent science advisors, but we have seen serious efforts to curtail or influence their reviews at a number of agencies. And of course, we must defeat the EPA's so-called science transparency rulemaking. But beyond that, we need to actively support scientific integrity standards within the federal government to put up firewalls that protect independent science supported by taxpayers from political appointees that might seek to suppress, influence, or spin the results. That is exactly why I introduced the Scientific Integrity Act, which now has over 155 co-sponsors in the House, to make sure science integrity officials are empowered to insulate federal researchers from attacks on their work. The Scientific Integrity Act would set baseline standards for scientific integrity policies across all federal agencies involved in research. This bill would make it clear that independent science should be the basis for shaping federal policy, free from inappropriate political interference or bias due to ideology or conflicts of interest. It would require federal agencies that fund or direct public science to create and enforce clear standards. Currently, more than 20 federal agencies have some form of scientific integrity policy, but their reach and enforcement remains uneven and sometimes unpredictable. At many agencies, the agenda may continue to be set by industry at the highest levels, but strong, strictly enforced science integrity policies could help to prevent some of the worst offenses. Combating the worst offenses and eventually rebuilding these institutions will not be easy. But having partners like the Center for American Progress, Secretary Moniz, and our nation's great national labs and research institutions will make it all possible. Once again, I want to thank the CAP staff that worked on this report. Preserving federal climate data and continuing to fund this research is critical to allowing our federal government to pick up the pieces when we have an administration actually interested in dealing in reality and making our nation a leader in climate solutions and the clean energy revolution. We know how important these data are to developing lasting and meaningful policy, and I hope the courts will agree that capricious attempts to roll back sound policy simply should not stand. So thank you again. I hope we can all work together to ensure funding for this critical research, restore scientific integrity across the federal government, and rein in undue political interference in science at the highest levels of the administration. Thank you, everyone, for your kind attention, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Congressman. You truly, truly are leading this charge on the Hill, and we really appreciate your leadership. You really demonstrated the gravity of the situation, so thank you. Now, let me invite our next discussion to the stage, and the founder of the Center for American Progress, John Podesta, who led President Obama's efforts to address climate change while serving as a senior advisor and counselor, and has championed scientific integrity throughout his entire career. Literally, as we were putting the report together, there were points that we were looking at different programs, and he said, oh yeah, I gave a speech back then about NSF and protected that at this point in my career. So this has been a lifelong process throughout his entire career of public service. Thank you and welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Christy. As Christy noted, today the report we're putting out outlines how federal funding for climate and energy data programs is at risk. To be clear, and I think Ernie will second this, the United States is the preeminent source for climate and energy data and analysis. Their use at home and abroad informs decision-making that's crucial to reducing risks and saving costs and saving lives. Across the federal government, funding for satellites, for sensors, for supercomputers, as well as the career scientists who design and operate them enable us to better understand the problem of climate change and how our economy and energy systems contribute to them and what we need to do to combat it. Other reports, by the way, have examined broader environmental research or clean energy R&D funding. I want to thank the Congressman for framing that as a more holistic approach. But this report specifically discusses climate and energy data programs because they form the publicly available backbone of domestic and international research and collaboration. They're vital to our understanding of effects of climate change is having on our atmospheric and oceanic systems. Christy noted that people breathed a sigh of relief because the Congress did its job, actually, when on a bipartisan basis they passed the recent omnibus spending bill, which rejected deep cuts to these vital programs of $2.4 billion that had been proposed by the Trump administration. And notwithstanding that bipartisan congressional support, the programs remain at risk, especially because of the discretion that the political appointees in the administration have to fund or not to fund, or to defund or to reprogram data collection activities. They can literally bury the data. I want to give you just a couple of examples of things that have happened. And again, these are subsequent to the passage of the omnibus, where Congress restored the deep cuts that the administration proposed. NASA's carbon monitoring system, which helps monitor deforestation remotely and globally, has been zeroed out because it was not specifically protected in the omnibus. U.S. contributions to international scientific collaborations like the UN IPCC or the World Meteorological Organization's Global Climate Observation System have been severely cut or eliminated. Other programs remain at risk. Each of President Trump's budget requests of singled out greenhouse gas reporting programs at the EPA, as well as the computational programs that serve as the backbone of DOE's climate modeling capabilities. Appropriated dollars for these programs are at risk of being reprogrammed. And I could go on with the list. But there's no one better to talk about the importance of good data, of reliable data, and good data collection systems, and the risk that we have from losing that data than my good friend and the former Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, who has throughout his career in science and public service has tackled really some of the most pressing and I would say existential questions that we face as a society, as Congressman Tonko noted. Secretary Moniz is the current president and CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative, and they've been a collaborator with us on this project. The co-chair and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. He's returned to his longtime academic home at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As the 13th Secretary of Energy, he led such initiatives as mission innovation. He played a critical role in the negotiations leading to the Iran nuclear deal, which has been noted, and in the formulation and implementation of President Obama's Climate Action Plan, including undertaking the first ever quadrennial energy review, and particularly the first one focusing on energy infrastructure. He provided enormous leadership and support to DOE's critical role in data collection, supercomputing, and analysis. So, Ernie, I really want to start at a very high level, which is we're talking about these data programs and collection programs, and particularly the U.S. programs. A lot of what people see and what's written about in the newspapers comes from reports that are developed by the UN IPC, the IPCC. It seems like one of these big global blobs, but that's out there, that's producing reports, and they produce them, each one of which gets more and more dire, I would say. But isn't the backbone of that research really the U.S. collection programs? And give us a sense of how valuable these are, both in the United States, but also more generally and more globally.
Sure, but actually, I'm going to start out with an even higher level in the sense that I want to acknowledge Congressman Tonko, who, when I was secretary, certainly was one of the great champions, particularly on the clean energy side, to work with. So those were fun. It was fun, and we got some stuff done. So, John, with your question, well, there's no question the range of data that we get, not DOE, from NOAA, from NASA, et cetera, carbon emissions data, ocean, you mentioned ocean data, fate of plankton and the like, critical, obviously surface water data. We go on and on and on. These are all part of a really integrated view of what is happening to the Earth system. The United States drives a lot of this, and internationally, in fact, as you know very well, there are international concerns already having been expressed about what's going to happen if the United States creates data gaps in these, particularly in these longitudinal studies that are absolutely critical and have been going on for a long time. The U.S. Global Change Program, for example, that was put in place in the late 80s during the senior Bush administration. We're talking here about 30 years of effort across 10 agencies, and that could be severely disrupted now if we cause a major dislocation. But I want to also emphasize, besides that international dimension, some very explicit utilization of IPCC reports of these data, et cetera, domestically. It's I'd go beyond a little bit of what you said. For example,
and of course the U.S. climate assessment.
Yeah, and the U.S. climate assessment. But our national security community, our intelligence community, relies upon these data and these reports for everything from understanding the risk of military facilities, there seems to be a correlation of naval bases being kind of like on the ocean, you
On the
know,
ocean.
and to also the international predictors.
As someone who grew up in Chicago, we think of Great Lakes as really one of the most important.
That's you mean the North Coast. That's right. But those security issues are really of great concern. Military bases, but also to now again going back globally, the anticipation of environmental disasters and major dislocations of populations, Africa, etc. These are big time issues for the United States to face. It doesn't matter if you choose the frankly completely unsupportable position about questioning the need to respond to global warming in a policy sense. I mean, there is no science issue in terms of establishing, being well over the threshold for that kind of policy response. No matter where you stand on that, it is completely illogical to not want to see those data continue unless, frankly, you don't have a pursuit for the truth and for the necessary responses at the heart of what you are doing.
Is it? Do you think underlying that is that it's not illogical at all? That really the people who are implementing these programs actually know they're essentially not telling the truth to the American people, and the way to deal with that is to bury the data.
I did say illogical, unless, and I think I'll leave it at that.
All right. I want to go. Can you go a little bit deeper on the data gap problem, which is this? I think a lot of people think, well, okay, and again, the congressman listed a whole series of initiatives of trying to roll back Obama-era policy to try to deal with climate change, but there's at least some hope that with a different president, new president, that those can be reversed, just as he's trying to reverse President Obama. But what happens when there are gaps in these longer system and longitudinal studies?
Well, I mean, we see that, of course, not only in the climate issue, I might say, but in many other kinds of studies where the longitudinal process is so important. But here, I think, for one thing, I hate to say that we are seeing such an acceleration of change that we really need to maintain this continuous database. Congressman Tonko just mentioned one example based upon, again, a long longitudinal study. This question of hurricanes now being seen by observation to have slowed down. A reminder that Houston got hammered because the hurricane kind of sat for a while. Now that in turn involved, I think probably involved, to be honest, this is the kind of thing where good database and analysis, including probably large scale modeling, is critical, because shall we say, the activities of the jet stream, for example, the changes that we are seeing almost certainly look to be correlated with that kind of phenomenon that we saw. We just have to have the data and the honest analysis to look at phenomena like this.
Another recent example, I think, that just came out is the increase in the melting of the Antarctic ice shelf.
Melting of the ice, yes.
Going at a triple the rate that we saw.
In fact, one of the things you kind of alluded to.
Of course, if it's triple the rate, you have to know what the rate was before.
Exactly, right. And you better keep looking at that pace. But you kind of alluded to it earlier, the IPCC reports, and you said each one becoming more dire. I think, here you've got literally thousands of scientists across the world coming together, doing peer review, multi-year process in each case. And I think it is the nature of the scientific community to always be a little bit conservative. And each succeeding report shows, yes, indeed, we were a bit conservative in the last one. And this seems to be going on. So there's no question that the consequences are looking more and more severe. And if I may veer a little bit into the clean energy space, let's be honest. 2 degrees is looking pretty damn tough. It's going to take significant acceleration of the clean energy transition to get there. So this is serious stuff.
Carbon removal?
Well, I think my speech on that is that if you look across the sectors, we always love to talk about electricity because that's the one we can see line of sight to getting done, and then we want to electrify everything that we can. Unfortunately, it doesn't take too much imagination to see how difficult that's going to be for the rest of the transportation sector beyond light-duty vehicles. It certainly points out the difficulties with industry and where high-temperature process heat is a big deal. And so my conclusion is if we are going to reach the kinds of goals we're talking about, there has to be another big card in the deck, and that is large-scale carbon management. Ultimately, hopefully including so-called negative emissions. So this is going to be a tough road. And the thing that should be completely non-controversial are the underlying data to understanding what's happening to the Earth system. By the way, another one that I would just add, and this is kind of personal, is understanding the future of the forests. I have a place in southern Colorado in the San Juan Mountains, and the bark beetle vector is getting uncomfortably close. And there's no doubt it's associated with the warming climate.
So given that we believe in good data and peer review, I want you to tell me whether we're crying wolf in suggesting that the administration, notwithstanding the bipartisan support for these programs that was just evidenced in the omnibus bill, has the actual authority and discretion to begin to either not spend the money, reprogram the money, move the money around. What's your view about both the authority to do that and what you're seeing to the extent that you're still in touch with some of your former colleagues?
Mm-hmm. First of all, John, let me say that that I think your statement was too soft in terms of what the Congress did, because you said they restored kind of the proposed cuts. They actually more than restored them. Yeah, amazing. I mean, BER, Biological Environmental Research at DOE, actually got more than a 10% increase, low 600s to 670 something. And right now, given the marks, I'm betting they're going to go to 700 million this year. And also on clean energy technology, more than 10%. Actually, over 2 years, it looks like there's going to be like a 20% increase. So it's the 20% per year we proposed in mission innovation, except it's 2 years. But not bad for government work.
Yeah.
So I think this is really quite exceptional. Now, as you know, I think the budget comes out of the Appropriations Committee at various control points where the budgets are constrained unless you go back for a reprogramming, this kind of thing. And within that, then the agencies have a fair amount of discretion, depending upon the extent to which the appropriators have written strong guidance in terms of substructure in the bill. Now, I have to admit, as Secretary of Energy, I kept trying to tell the appropriators to have fewer control points.
Have a different view these days?
Our CFO, Joe Heiser, is there, and he never delivered on these fewer control points. It's an obvious tension, but the reality is that fundamentally, if the guidance is not very explicit, and you gave an example of when it wasn't explicit that the change was made, or frankly, the way it works, kind of on the ground, the appropriation staff staying tightly coupled to the programs, and even if the guidance wasn't written, providing additional guidance, which you accommodate or pay for later, that there is that kind of flexibility. So I think you're absolutely right in stating that vigilance is required beyond the appropriations process. But one other thing, and again, our CFO, actually OMB CFO type, Joe Heischer, has also emphasized there's something else which I'll bet a lot of people haven't even heard of, which is the OMB apportionment process. So it's one thing to get the appropriations and to get the guidance, but then under the guise of strict financial management, OMB meters out the funds, apportions them, tells Treasury at the same time, okay, you can pay the bills up to this amount and not more, otherwise somebody goes to jail. And the problem is the risk, and I would add this to your litany, is that to be honest, trust me, some of my best friends are at OMB, but the apportionment process has been occasionally used to put in place some policy directions that were not part of the original budget. Like, for example, bluntly, they lost the battle on the budget, but they get you on the apportionment, right? So anyway, that's just the way the government. That's the way it works. But I mean, again, I'm not saying there shouldn't be an apportionment process because it is about financial controls. But I think it's got to be. There are many points along the chain to actually get a program approved, done, executed.
Well, maybe good news from the climate perspective is that Director Mulvaney is spending all his time trying to dismantle the CFPB and doesn't have time to pay attention to these programs as well. Although I think he works hard.
Well, look, I mean, but I think obviously the budget creation process in this administration does seem to be a little bit different than we've been accustomed to. And Director Mulvaney has certainly seen that his former colleagues were not terribly interested in the budgets that were being sent up with these draconian cuts. But that is where the point that you make, there are other ways of, at least on the margins, affecting what actually happens.
Are you concerned about some of the systems really require strong commitment to multi-year funding?
Yeah.
That's not just true in the domestic agencies, certainly true in DOE, but NOAA satellite programs, certainly the Intel systems, DoD systems, et cetera, rely on long-term funding. Is there a risk of sort of start in terms of being both, I guess, from a taxpayer perspective, that invariably ends up costing more money, but also that the systems, by delaying the systems, you could manage to undermine the programmatic effectiveness of them?
Right. Well, first of all, it's fairly obvious, and we've discussed things like longitudinal data sets, it's fairly obvious that when you're looking at the Earth system and the data sets, this is inherently a multi-year thing. You need a multi-year horizon with continuity. In reality, of course, those programs mainly are nevertheless funded year by year. But to be fair, I think Congress, not only this Congress now, but Congress, I think, has done a reasonable job of recognizing the importance of reasonable degrees of continuity in these programs. Now, I think on capital projects, it's a little bit different. Mm-hmm. Unless there's something that just isn't working right.
That's like satellites, sonars,
yes,
big systems.
And once you start, I mean, once you start a big capital project, it's a big deal, frankly, to not carry it through. And furthermore, there's a lot of people who are going to be very helpful in sustaining these projects if they're big capital projects. But I think on the multi-year funding, it is I think it's very desirable. It can be misused, including by delaying things, because all you do is roll the funds over as opposed to telling the appropriators, I'm just not going to spend the money. So I think it's a balance. But look, the reality is, I think in principle, fewer control points, more multi-year funding would be very, very helpful in the science business, where where so many things have multi-year horizons. But you also rely upon responsible management of that system.
If there is interference in the U.S. collection systems, or data gaps, or the other kinds of problems that we've talked about in terms of collecting data, does the international community have the capacity to backfill? Can the Nordics or China or the EU essentially replicate what the U.S. is putting into the global public goods?
I think for some of it, but it's pretty hard. Especially, look, let's say the Earth observation systems from NASA. I mean, you could imagine a 5-year negotiation to make them international partnerships, but then there you have a 5-year gap right there. So it's very hard. I mean, because again, we've had such a consistent commitment in this area now for decades, and it's kind of baked into the global system that these are the expectations that are going to be met. I might say, but in addition to the international thing, I'm also very concerned about the fine-grained data for the United States in terms of being able to address more convincingly. And we have to admit, as I said earlier, that it's a no-brainer about understanding the global warming and climate challenges in terms of the need for an overall policy response, et cetera. But as you get down to more and more fine-grained regional impacts, et cetera, we have a lot more to learn, a lot more data to apply, a lot more scientific understanding. So I'm worried both at the kind of the global level, but also at the fine-grained level here in the United States to understand ecosystems and the like.
We've been talking about the systems, the data, the collection. Congressman Tonka raised the question of the brain drain. How significant of a problem do you think this general disregard for science in the administration, how big of a problem is it in terms of affecting people's decision? We'll hear a little bit more about that, I think, on the next panel, too.
Well, Mr. Macron has certainly an open invitation, apparently. No, look, it's a real issue. I think actually the uncertain situation with regard to science and facts in general, I would actually elevate the level of alarm to a very fundamental assault on democracy. I mean, it's nothing short of that, to be perfectly honest. And I think in that situation, scientists leaving is a real risk. Of course, as long as Congress maintains the funding overall across the board, it may be in more specific scientific disciplines where you'll see that, and of course the climate science could be one of those. So it's a real issue, I think, yeah.
I've got time for one more question, and I want to go on to a different topic because you're here, you're an expert. I think people in the audience would be interested in your reaction.
Shall we ask for guesses as to what this question is going to be about?
To the Singapore summit.
The Singapore summit. Singapore sling.
And what was missing from the joint statement, and what you think the prospects are going forward for the ability to actually get.
It's an easier question answered the other way. That's what's missing. But anyway.
Just give us a reaction to
well, okay.
Was anything achieved? If so, what should we be looking for in terms of the next steps?
I think
the President's already patted himself on the back and said there is no more nuclear problem in DPRK.
Right.
But
so look, let me say flat out. First of all, I support the idea of getting into this dialogue and negotiation. I mean, I think I think it's time to start a discussion, and the reality is, for whatever reason, the sanctions, the other reasons, the North Korean leader does seem to be in a position where I think you can't walk away from at least seeing what's real there. That's the first point. The second point is that what has been achieved, and it's not just the summit, but in this process leading up to it, is we do appear to have a suspension of nuclear and missile testing in the North, and of course now suspension of joint military exercises with the United States and its allies. However, now comes the missing part. One thing missing for sure, by the way, is a disciplined multilateral process without which we can never actually reach an agreement. Another thing missing dramatically, and I wrote an op-ed on this back in March for both looking at both Iran and Korea, and the title of it was "Don't Trust and Verify, Verify, Verify." And the point there is the heart of the Iran agreement is actually the unique verification regime, which obviously is now in danger of being lost, and that's a story we could go down to. But now North Korea, the verification regime there is going to be even tougher. No mention of it whatsoever. And my view was that, look, the summit wasn't the place for detailed negotiation and hashing out things. I mean, that would have been not a good idea. But it could have been a place to establish key principles, like, for example, understanding there is going to have to be early on a very strong discussion about verification, which is going to be a tough one. Now, where we are today, no nuclear weapons tests, no missile tests, that we can verify. Any next step, we can't without boots on the ground, etc. Nuclear materials production, I mean, all kinds of things. And I'll just note that the verification issues are so tough with North Korea for lots of reasons. One of them is that we don't know how many nuclear weapons they have, right? And so you start thinking through this, it's going to be very, very tough. And I think that should have been something at least established as a key focus of negotiations going forward. That and the multilateralism, I think, were two major.
At the multilateral diplomacy level, is that resurrecting the six-party talks, or largely getting more in a dialogue with the IAEA?
I think
or a little of both.
Well, I think it's six parties, but not necessarily in the format of the six-party talks. Let me give you an example of the Iran negotiation. The Iran negotiation were 8-party talks, but in the negotiation, the United States was understood by all to have the face-to-face negotiating role with Iran. The EU was the convener of the negotiation, and it was the U.S. responsibility as the face-to-face negotiator to make sure that we were on the same page with the Europeans and Russia and China. And that was not trivial, because I remind you, the year when the Iran agreement was done, and the critical period was February to July of 2015, and that was already a year after the Ukraine incursion. So we were already in a pretty rough spot in terms of U.S.-Russia relationships and European-Russia relationships, and yet it was a disciplined negotiation. Everyone had a common objective, et cetera. By the way, I'm sorry, I'm going on an aside here, but this is also a reason why it's pretty churlish to say that the Iran agreement should have gone beyond the nuclear weapon remit and solved all the regional problems.
Right.
Yeah, we would have had a lot of coherence with the other parties, right? There would have been no negotiation at all. I mean, you couldn't even start it, really. So, so I think, again, I'm not saying it's exactly the template, but it's got to be something like that. You can't have the actual face-to-face negotiation being done multilaterally, but you got to do a lot. You got to work hard at keeping all the partners together and informed, and there may be a parallel in there.
Well, notwithstanding where we are now in Iran, I want to just thank you for your leadership, your ability to bring that deal home, particularly on the topics that you've been talking about. And I think we can continue to watch and see whether the Europeans can hold a agreement together. But thank you again for what you did for our country and for the world.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks for looking at these climate data issues. I mean, which are really important.
Great.
And have to be sustained.
All right, join me in thanking Secretary Moniz.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, John, for getting into the details of the budget process and shedding some more light on the overall problem here. We're going to round out our discussion today with a panel that connects the budget and policymaking process in Washington to the labs and universities across the country and around the world, and also the people that are really connected to the budget process. In addition to supporting international collaboration on climate science and energy discovery, U.S. data and analysis feed the research conducted at universities, the decisions of state, local, and tribal leaders, and the investment made by businesses and families. So to lead this conversation, I would like to call up to the podium while we have a bit of a set change here, Beena Venkatraman. I think I got that right. Beena Venkatraman to come and introduce the rest of the panel. As a journalist and writer, Beena has covered ocean currents and geoengineering. As a public servant, she served as senior advisor on climate change innovation to President Obama and led the Climate Data Initiative. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to the next part of the conversation.
I'll just welcome the panelists to come up with me since the set change was so efficient, and just say thank you to the Center for American Progress, to Christy and John, and the energy team here for having this really important conversation about the threats to the federal climate research enterprise and to really the scientific enterprise at this critical moment. It's my pleasure to be here and to be with this great panel of experts who are going to help us talk. The plan for the panel is really to get a little bit more granular on some of the issues that have been raised at a high level already, which is to say what's really at stake here when we talk about threats to federal climate research, observation systems, and data. What are the specific threats, and also sort of what is happening more broadly on scientific integrity. So we have this wonderful group of people here with us that I'm just going to welcome and introduce to you. We have Joel Clements over here on the end. I'll just go in order. And Joel is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School and also a senior fellow at the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He most recently left the Department of Interior, where he was the head of the Office of Policy Analysis. And a bit later, we're going to hear more about his departure, which has been well publicized. But we're going to start the conversation a little bit, back up a little bit from that. And we have Kei Koizumi here next to Joel. And Kei I really think of him as the guru of the federal R&D budget, but he has more formal titles. Right now, he's the senior fellow at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For 8 years of the Obama administration, Kei served as the assistant director for federal research and development at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as a senior advisor to the NSTC. Welcome, Kei. And here we have Deborah Lawrence. And Deborah is a professor of environmental sciences at the University of Virginia. She's an award-winning scientist who studies the connections between tropical deforestation and climate change. Dr. Lawrence has won numerous awards that I can't list all of them today, including a Guggenheim, a Jefferson Science Fellowship from the National Academy, and she's also served in some critical government advisory roles. She served in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the State Department in 2009 and 2010, and she's been a consultant to USAID and the U.S. Forest Service on issues related to her research. So welcome. So I want to get us started, and Joel, I'd hope you would cue us off here and talk a little bit about your role at the Department of Interior and what you have observed in terms of the importance of these kinds of climate data and climate research programs, not just to the service of science and our understanding, but really to the service of society.
Oh, thanks, Bina. I'm happy to do that. And thanks to CAP for inviting me to be on the stage here. This is fantastic. What a great group of folks. And the previous session, of course, was super too. So happy to be here. I was, as the director of the policy office at Interior, I played a number of roles. I was a top climate policy advisor there, but also led what became our federal response, particularly in the executive branch, to the slow-moving disaster happening in the Alaskan Arctic. So in a way, I talk about this story as a way to kind of bring home the impacts of climate change and why we need the information to explain exactly what's happening and at what rate it's happening. So we have villages in the Arctic who are on the brink of being washed away right now. There are dozens of them, actually, and a half dozen that are probably one storm away from being washed away. These are villages on very narrow strips of permafrost that face directly out to the storms coming in from the Chukchi and Bering Seas. So they're in a very difficult place, which wasn't quite as unsafe decades ago. Now, unfortunately, that permafrost is melting beneath their feet, and the sea ice doesn't set up to protect them from the fall storms anymore. So every storm season, we all keep our fingers crossed that one of these villages doesn't get washed away. So we have, Secretary Moniz mentioned how dislocation of cultures and populations can affect our national security interests, but we have American citizens facing the same thing, right? And so we've tried to spend over the years I was in the administration prior, some time and effort and research dollars on understanding what that transition is going to mean and how can we relocate villages out of harm's way. So this is just one example. I do want to expand the geography a little bit by mentioning that a couple months ago a report came out. It was a NOAA and USGS report, so it was partly a DOI report. It was funded by DOD, and it described that its finding was that the low-lying atolls in the Pacific, many of which we share some responsibility for supporting, have a lot less time than we thought. Right? We knew about sea level rise, and these low-lying atolls probably by the end of the century would no longer be viable places to keep those cultures in place. We just found out it's mid-century. So, and this science has just come out, it's just been published, and all of a sudden these populations, which all of them are very distinct cultures and punch way above their weight in terms of their contribution to cultural diversity, right? And many of these have very close relationships with America. They've got less than 30 years in some cases in this location, right? So that's less time than we can't do anything about climate mitigation in that period of time, right? We've already baked in 30 years worth of climate change. So we need to start finding ways to either relocate or in some way barge fresh water out to these atolls in the middle of the Pacific, right? So it's untenable in many situations.
And this really relied on U.S.-based observation systems to establish.
It was the U.S.-based research systems. It was the findings. This was NOAA and USGS that developed this work. So it suddenly just changed their time horizon for relocation by half a century, and that is absolutely essential. So without that information, they don't, prior to this information coming out, they thought they had a little bit of time. No longer the case. The Alaskan Native villages, same thing, a little closer tied to some of the meteorological phenomena that take place in the Arctic right now. We know the rate of melting, and we know the permafrost is degrading, but when are these big storms coming in? What does it mean? What is the level of overwash going to be? Exactly how much time do they have? And we need to have that information in place. So not only, of course, is it important for the science enterprise, but it's important for American health and safety, and that's always my bottom line.
You're reminding me of an anecdote, which is really a natural experiment that I was told about when working in the administration, and it's really about NOAA. And I like to call it the tale of two cyclones. In 1999, there was a severe cyclone that hit the Indian state of Odisha, killed 10,000 people. The cost was something like $5 billion US. 14 years later, a very similar cyclone hit the region, and only 40 casualties, very low cost. And you might wonder, what's the difference? Well, the difference was a partnership between NOAA and the Indian Ministry on Earth Sciences, and a forecast window that extended from 48 hours to 98 hours and allowed mass evacuations. And so the kind of lives that are at stake and the kind of actions for preparedness that can be taken as a result of U.S. partnerships and U.S. data around the world, I think are a great point to raise. Deborah, I'd love to turn to you because you're an academic scientist and your work is really at this critical nexus of land use and climate change. And I know that you rely heavily on federally funded climate research, observation systems, and data sets for your work, and that a lot of that work is groundbreaking. Can you tell us a little bit about why these sort of the enterprise that is currently under threat, how it serves the purposes of your work in understanding phenomena, but also in trying to help communities?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. I have spent my whole career studying land use change and particularly tropical rainforests. And initially, I studied them right there in the rainforest where I could take my own samples of soil, I could collect measurements of trees, I could do what I wanted to do by myself or with my team. But after doing that for about 20 years, I realized that what was happening at the rainforest edge wasn't just having an impact on the local environment or the local people, which I was worried about. It was also having an effect on the globe. So when I went to college, deforestation was responsible for 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. When I got to the State Department to worry about climate and forests in the climate office, it was about 15%. It's about 9% now. You might think, well, that sounds like things are getting better. Unfortunately, that's because the fossil fuel part has gone up and up and up, not because deforestation has gone down. So my bottom line here is you cannot understand the environment without lots of excellent data. And you certainly can't understand what's happening to the entire land surface without lots of excellent data. So the kinds of data that I use now are not the things I can gather in a soil by myself. I use the very models that our federal government supports. I use the climate models, the Earth system models that allow me to say, what happens when you deforest a large fraction of the Earth? What happens to the climate system? How does it feed back? How does it affect the land? And of course, ultimately, we care about that because we want to know what happens to all the people who depend on that land. So I can't do my work. And in fact, those modelers can't do their work if we don't have all these monitoring systems that tell us not just what the temperature is around the globe and the rainfall, but that is a proxy for soil moisture. We don't really care about rainfall or temperature. We want to know if there's water in the ground to grow crops. Well, we have sensors that will tell us around the world what soil moisture is. That's amazing. So the more you can correlate things like rainfall and temperature with soil moisture, the better we can understand how climate affects the land now. And if we can't understand how climate affects the land now, we certainly can't understand how climate will affect the land in the future. So the models depend on understanding the relationships between these critical parameters now so that we can bake that knowledge into our models and then help people all over the globe.
Can you say a word about your research in East Africa, which you recently published a paper about, which is an example of this?
Yeah, so perfect example is we are studying the Great Lakes region of East Africa, 9 countries, millions and millions of people, and we tried to take the climate scenarios for the future, a warmer planet, and ask the question, what's the heat stress for these people? How many people are going to be exposed to a certain level of heat that is not just bad, but really bad? So we looked at these climate futures based on models that our federal dollars created. We looked at future population trajectories based on population models that our climate scientists developed. And we looked at these correlations between heat and health that our scientists also developed. We laid them over one on top of the other to be able to say, in the future, in 2050 or in 2100, we're going to have a lot more people at risk, not just because of climate change, but because of population change. And we could say where exactly those people are likely to be. And in fact, when you look at these maps, you think, well, they can't possibly be there. That is too much stress, which gets to, I think, one of your points and one of the points raised earlier. Those people are going to move. There's no way they'll be there. It's too stressed. You could have 300 days a year where you're feeling heat stress. No one is going to stay there. So in a way, we think, well, that's sort of a silly exercise. Why'd you say that? Why do you say there's going to be 300 days a year? Well, we say that because we're saying, well, they probably won't be there. Because if it's going to get that bad, they're going to move before that happens. We need to know about that. The important thing about that study in East Africa is that all that data is free and available to anyone, they don't all have the capacity to take that data and make it useful. So one of the roles of United States scientists is to take that data that anyone could have and make it useful to people around the globe in places like East Africa, where the data they have on the ground, the actual thermometers, the actual rain gauges, the actual river discharge, they don't have great data. So our data that we collect remotely is really great. We have data they don't have, so we can actually put it to use, trying to anticipate the future and hopefully figure out how we can adapt.
Great. We're going to come back to what you think might be under threat at the moment, but I want to turn to Kay. And Kay, you really have had your finger on the pulse of the federal R&D budget for a decade now, and you've been tracking this issue closely in the current administration. Your report for Novem, Warning Signs, which I commend to everyone here, really looked at the issues before Congress passed the omnibus and looked at the president's proposal for cuts across these various programs and data sets. I just want to get a sense from you. We've talked a bit about the scientific understanding and the sort of role that these data sets play in preparing communities for climate change. What do you think is at stake when it comes to U.S. leadership, U.S. innovation, and public health in the United States when you look at these proposed cuts?
Right. Well, I think the first message that I would want to send is that we are not safe yet in terms of either the climate and energy research and data enterprise or the broader U.S. scientific enterprise, because it's one of the challenges of thinking about science funding is that science and data are, of course, multi-year, long-term efforts, but they are funded through an annual budget and appropriations process in the federal government. So each year we have to keep investing in the future, or that future is never going to come. So even though we had a fairly positive 2018 outcome for the federal government's funding that responded to Congress restoring many of the cuts that were proposed for 2018, now we are here looking at a 2019 budget from the administration that repeats many of those cuts that were proposed last year. And although we are counting on Congress to once again restore funding, I worry that because of the nature of our federal science enterprise, we're not going to be able to save everyone. One of the beauties of our U.S. government research enterprise is that we have 20 different federal departments and agencies that are involved in supporting research, in research and also climate research and energy data. Whether you look at the CAP report or the Novem report that I co-authored, or the U.S. Global Change Research Program, a dozen different agencies are all part of the ecosystem that support climate and energy research and data. And we rely on all of these agencies and their programs to contribute their parts. And because of the way the federal budget process works, you all already heard that there is a lot of discretion for agency leadership and for the Office of Management and Budget's leadership to go into the details of the programs and apportion funding in ways that may not be positive for these research programs. So what we have here is that the hundreds of programs that we rely on, the network of laboratories, research facilities, university research grants, federal laboratories and their scientists who are working on long-term problems, research vessels, stream gauges, etc. It's going to take continuing investments in all of those hundreds of programs for us to have a U.S. research enterprise. So I do worry that we are still a long way from assuring a future for this part of the U.S. science and research enterprise. And
so, Kay,
yes.
One of the issues raised by the Secretary and John was this difference between apportionment and appropriations. Right. The report, CAP's report released this morning, talks about the rescission requests and how basically the White House has made a number of requests, including implicating EPA and USDA funding, that would take some $15 billion out of the budget that has been given to those agencies. How concerned are you by things like that? Can you read the tea leaves a little bit on how Congress might respond?
I'm worried, having been on the other end. So, I mean, one of the pleasures of serving in the last administration was actually helping Secretary Moniz work this apportionment process to make sure that things that were in the budget but were not explicitly addressed by Congress still managed to get through and get started. And now I see that a different administration has the power to potentially rescind funds, never obligate funds, to divert funds from areas that we would like them to go to toward other areas. So all of that is still there. And I also worry because I don't have enough of the information to know exactly what I should be worried about. So that's why we are on the alert for things like news such as the NASA Climate Information Program. It suddenly pops up as something that Congress did not specifically restore. So there was an opening for the administration to try to cancel it. And I live in fear of the next programs that we're made aware of, and of the programs that we'll never be made aware of, but they may die quiet, unmourned deaths. Well, that's right. I continue to worry a lot, and also because of so many things that are at stake. So within the Novem report, we tried to break out the impacts of these climate and environment research and data programs into 5 main areas. So I'll just summarize them. So one was research investment and capacity. These programs underpin the traditional and long-standing U.S. preeminence in research on these topics. Second, Earth observations, data, and modeling. Our models are world-leading, and they're based on careful curation and careful development. And they're also irreplaceable because we can't backfill missing data. Can we backfill a stream gauge near Houston if we're missing a year's worth of data? No, we can't. Can we backfill temperature records throughout the American West if we miss a year? No, we can't. I think the third is adaptation and assessment capability, in that not only federal agencies but local and state communities all around the country rely on these data and this research to be able to make decisions about how to preserve their communities in the face of a changing climate and environmental conditions. We're in danger of losing that. Fourth is the workforce, that we have thousands of scientists and engineers and graduate students in the sciences and engineering whose careers and educations could be interrupted by a lapse of even 1 year in a federal research program support. And finally, the international commitments, that our U.S. contributions are crucial to things like the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so many other treaty commitments in environmental areas. Without the data, without the research, the United States will not be able to participate in many of these international efforts to understand what's happening to our planet.
I want to bring Kay in on that. Kay, I want to bring in Deborah on that point. Deborah, you have obviously had some involvement in the deliberations of the UNFCCC, and you saw this several orders of magnitude drop in U.S. funding, not just for the Framework Convention, but also for World Meteorological Organization efforts, which underpin the IPCC, as we all know. So how do you think this will affect U.S. leadership? How important is the funding? How important is the research enterprise that we're contributing to our position?
It's extremely important. I think, it's sort of crushing to think that we're not supporting these organizations that we worked so hard to build. Also, I know from my own work on the land that our data are quite unique. So the data that we provide as the U.S. government, we're one of many Earth observing entities. There's lots of satellites out there, but guess whose are free? Ours are free. So that's pretty different from much of the rest of the world. There are other satellites up there, they cost money. And that free satellite data has gone into so many emissions reports at the UNFCCC, where governments are some governments, all they have is land use change. They're not very developed. They don't have a lot of fossil fuel emissions, but they're cutting their forests quite rapidly. So their big chunk of emissions comes from the forest. Their ability to put that into a report to the UN comes directly from our ability to provide those data basically for free. Not only do we provide data, we often provide people. So it's that capital, the other kind of capital. We provide EPA advisors to help people put together inventories to go to those negotiations. I don't know how you can get a bunch of countries together to negotiate if they all don't know what they're negotiating with. How do you get countries together to talk about reducing emissions if they don't all have a good sense for what their emissions are? The United States has been a leader, especially in the land, but also in other realms of trying to get those emissions reports to be better.
Deborah, I just have to ask you, because you told me such an interesting story about what you used to do to collect data in Borneo before Landsat. Can you?
Well, Landsat was there, but it was a young program. And so for me to get a sense for how the landscape functioned, for like what the landscape looked like, because I couldn't look from space, I walked. I just walked and walked and walked for miles. And I put little flags up and I said, where do I find myself? Where am I? And I took notes and then I walked some more. So you can only walk so far if you're trying to understand the landscape. And you can only really understand one landscape, maybe one village. I studied one village in Borneo. It's absurd to think that you could really try to draw conclusions about how the rainforest works from one village in one landscape. And that is no longer the case. Like Landsat has an incredible archive at this point where you can actually go back in time and understand not just what it looks like now, but what it looked like 10 years ago when the climate was really bad, or 20 years ago when the climate was a little better, or 15 years ago when there was a volcanic emission somewhere and it was a bit cooler. So you can really start to tease out how the land and the climate systems work together simply because we have such an amazing set of data. So we're not relying on people just walking through the forest anymore.
I want to get back to this issue of continuity and longitudinal studies, which the Secretary and John were discussing as well. How important is this? I recently read the memoir of Charles David Keeling, who did the historic measurements of atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa, and it's amazing because in 1964 Congress actually cut the funding. There was a temporary budget cut. So there was a little blip in the data collection, and he sort of had a one-man crusade. If you believe his memoir, which involved a lot of other people coming to support it, to fight for that now critically important data set, which takes us from the late 50s to today, knowing how much atmospheric carbon there is. And without that, we'd be hard pressed to sort of be able to show what we have since the 70s, this precipitous rise. I'm just wondering if we try to be, instead of retrospective, like Keeling was in his memoir, but sort of prospectively thinking about what are those key data sets that might be under threat if we have cuts that affect continuity. What would those be? What are we looking at here in terms of what's most critical to protect?
Well, I just want to mention I'll segue into the question, because I want to mention the economic impact of having this kind of free data, right? Because I don't know, has anyone here ever gotten ticked off when Google Maps didn't have an update for the site you were trying to get to, right? So first of all, Google Maps wouldn't exist without Landsat, but imagine if there was a gap in those Landsat data and how disruptive that would be, right? So it penetrates even our lives. This isn't an abstract discussion about scientific data sets that will not affect your day-to-day. And I think that is important to note. The Weather Channel wouldn't exist without all those NOAA data. So gaps in data do affect us on a daily basis, and I think that's important. But I did just want to mention the Arctic, because we don't know enough about the Arctic, and it's warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. We know that much, but we don't know what the implications are of that. And so we actually need to build out our monitoring and observation systems, increase our ability and our capacity in that regard, not have to protect what we already have, because it's already not quite adequate. So there are the gaps that take place in current data collection, but then there are these enormous gaps that we need to fill very quickly in order to advance our American and global priorities going forward.
Also, I would just say that we have some new tools that are 15 to 20 years old, and you might think, isn't that enough? 15 to 20 years, doesn't that give you a good correlation, whatever you're looking for? No, it's really not. 16 is better than 15, 21 is better than 20, 25 is better than 24. we need a lot of data. And especially if you all might remember do you remember the pause, the warming, the gap, what do we call it, the hiatus? Mm-hmm. So that was a set of years when the temperature didn't seem to increase as rapidly. And some people think that's due to some natural variability that might be on a, say, 30-year time frame. Well, some of our data is only 50 years old. So how many 30-year cycles can you get with 50 years? We cannot have gaps right now. If we're going to put this to bed and to try to really understand the role of natural and human-made variation in the climate system, we need to have all of these data sets going forward. We cannot afford to have a gap right now.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't talked about yet is sort of the economic impact of some of these data. And so, for example, during the California drought, fifth largest economy in the world, major producer of produce for the country, the NASA GRACE satellites, twin satellites circling the Earth, were telling us how fast the Central Valley Aquifer was being drawn down, critical information for farmers, for industry, for residents. There are a lot of such uses of federal data, and we know that there's a billion-dollar company out there that was built on federal agriculture and climate data. How focused should we be? This is sort of a tactical question for all of you. On the iconic data sets that have commercial applications that are being used by businesses, which seem to have a sort of more blessed status sometimes, right? If we think of the National Weather Service or the GPS, Landsat, versus bringing up some of the less iconic programs and observation systems by either helping them develop that market and attention or by just giving them more sort of prominence.
Well, I'll just note that I don't think those iconic programs are as protected as we think they are. And I think we saw that in the last budget proposal. In particular, at Interior, every year we would see, we've seen threats to the stream gauge system, which is so essential for farmers and land managers around the country, and obviously Landsat and the implications for Google Maps and others. So getting into tactics, probably not my game, except to say that I don't think we can be as sanguine about the prospects for these iconic systems. I know Kay knows a lot more about all those other systems that we need to look out for.
Well, I would hope, again, that I hope that's not the choice that we're facing, because they are important. Not only the existing glamorous data sets and the not so glamorous data sets, but also the data sets that we'll need in the future that Joel talked about. I hope we haven't come to that point, because it is important to preserve and sustain investments for all of them. And we can do it. There are the resources potentially there to have a robust climate, energy, and environmental research and data infrastructure if we choose to make those investments.
I also wanted to point out that nifty satellite that told us about the water, it was actually designed to measure changes in ice, in the height of the ice. And then people figured out they could use it to actually track water in the ground instead of just in ice. So you get great, wonderful, economically valuable results sometimes from instruments that you thought were made for one thing and then turned out to be extremely valuable for measuring something else. I think we scientists could do a better job of linking what we're doing to actual problems. We often study them, we just don't know how to talk about that. Our university press offices could help us by saying, well, we'll write the press release if you could just tell us what you did. And then highlighting the cool science and the cool data sets that we use to get those results. So not just talking about whatever the impacts are, but trying to highlight the tools, might out some of those tools that haven't been so iconic.
I can tell we're all fans of the GRACE satellites.
Satellite.
Because it is incredibly cool to be able to measure water in the ground from way up in space.
By gravity, right?
By gravity,
Small changes
right.
in gravity. Yeah. It's sort of fascinating and very cool science that can draw people in. I want to turn us, we're going to do Q&A, just so everyone knows, so you can ask the questions I've failed to ask. But I want to turn us to a little bit of a broader question for the moment. And Joel, I'd love if you could sort of kick us off here, which is to say there are a lot of other things happening other than the proposed cuts to data and federal programs when it comes to scientific integrity, and we heard about some of them from the congressman. You had personal experience with this. Can you share a little bit about that experience? Many in the room may know, but at least sort of your experience of that and what your main concerns are when it comes to scientific integrity in this administration.
Okay, yeah, sure. And I know John mentioned the brain drain earlier, and there are a lot of facets to this effort on the part of the Trump administration. As I noted earlier, I was the director of the policy office at DOI, and I was a top climate policy advisor. And one day last June, actually just about a year ago, I got an email a Thursday night saying I'd been reassigned. It turns out there were dozens of us that were reassigned that night. I had been reassigned to the office that collects royalty income from the oil and gas and mining companies out there. So does anyone here think that smells like retaliation? Is there any, maybe just a hint? So there's an investigation underway, and the Inspector General at DOI, at the behest of 8 senators, did an investigation. And sure enough, they found that this was a very suspicious undertaking. They couldn't hold them legally accountable because they didn't keep a paper trail. But my whistleblower complaint that I submitted a month later is still under investigation. I took the unusual step when I submitted that complaint of going public with an op-ed in the Washington Post. And that's what Bina was referring to. There was a bit of a media frenzy for a while about this. And still to this day, a year later, not a week goes by that I'm not speaking with reporters about the hijinks going on at Interior and at EPA and other agencies, because they're targeting not just senior executives in our case, but other staff at all levels of the career ranks. And one of the things that happened after I submitted my complaint is that some of America's top legal scholars sent a letter on my behalf to the Office of Special Counsel, where I had lodged the complaint, saying this is dangerously close to politicizing the civil service, and that's a big no-no in the federal government. But it also is specific. It's turned out to be a tactic for targeting not just civil servants in general, but scientists in particular, scientists and experts. And we've seen this, I think, most strikingly at EPA, where some 700 or so folks have left, and the estimate is about 200 of those are scientists and experts that have been working directly on regulatory policies that affect American health and safety very directly. So,
is that a hard decision for you to leave? What was the last straw?
Well, I stuck around for a few months after submitting the whistleblower complaint, and I tried to have a go at it. And in fact, the people in that office, it was a fantastic office full of auditors trying to turn me into an auditing executive. You don't even have to, you don't have to balance your checkbook anymore. Yeah, so. Right. They were super. I had no complaints about that, but essentially it was a waste of taxpayer dollars to retrain me in that way. It was a waste of their time in bringing me along, and frankly, a waste of my salary. So I felt that they'd already taken my job. All I had left was my voice. So the decision actually wasn't that hard to leave at that point, to be able to keep these issues on the forefront and shine a light on the kinds of abuses that you're asking about now, because I don't think a week goes by where we don't hear of another instance where some member of the civil service, and often it's scientists and experts, are being targeted in some way or muzzled, or in some way that their grant proposals are being held up. A huge amount of federal dollars are not being spent on grants because the proposal may have included the words climate change. So that is a very insidious but very impactful attack on scientific integrity in the federal government.
Right, and so another way of asking that would be, would it have been a harder decision if you still felt you could have influence on the substance of the department's work, but you still felt there were inappropriate efforts to compromise integrity?
That would have been a hard decision, and my heart goes out to the people that are in that position right now, and I appreciate very deeply the civil servants that are sticking around to do the hard work despite an appalling lack of respect both for policy, personnel, and the American future. So it would have been a much more difficult decision, that's right.
Hey, what are some of the issues that you see that are concerning you the most? We have such a litany to choose from, the advisory council disbandments.
Right.
Where are you focusing your attention at the academies? How does this sort of, sorry, not at the academy, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science,
Well, I think, for me, I'm happy that this session not only talks about the research and data, but also how they're used, because, just as important as the federal government's support of research funding and data collection is the federal government's proper use of science in making decisions. and also the federal government, making sure that science is communicated by the federal scientists doing the research freely and honestly. So that leads me to focus a lot of my attention on scientific integrity, which Congressman Tonko started talking about. Because scientific integrity, his legislation, and also the policy that I worked on at OSTP, the government-wide scientific integrity policy, which, by the way, still stands for the most part for nearly all the agencies. I mean, policies like that are important because they ensure that political considerations and science are kept in their proper places, mostly independent of each other. Of course, you can't always, politics and science are both parts of decision making, but we need to make sure that federal scientists can do their research without political interference, and we need to make sure that federal science is used and communicated properly without that political interference. So I continue to worry about that because, to be honest, this OSTP policy on scientific integrity was never really designed for an EPA or Department of the Interior like this one. It depends on kind of good faith efforts to preserve science in agencies, and I'm not seeing that in at least those two agencies. I think another part that we, AAAS and other organizations, are worried about are the the scientific data guidelines that have come out recently from EPA that would exclude many important research studies and data sets from consideration in making federal policies. It reminds me all too well of the Secret Science Reform Act, which was a bill that was presented several years ago, and I was one of several people who actually wrote the administration veto threat against that bill. And now we find that it's come back as an EPA proposal. And that, of course, is damaging because we're making all of these investments in health research, environmental research. What good is it if we can't use the results of those investments in actually making decisions about our health and our environment? So I'm worried about that, and that's another thing that I'm trying to spend time to work on.
The point is really well taken and articulated, that there are these efforts and reforms that assume a set of conditions and a set of good faith behavior on the part of folks in the administration. And I think about the open data initiatives of President Obama, which I was very much in support of, his May 2013 executive order on open data that you were, of course, very involved in as well. And now this sort of weaponization of open data by EPA to say that transparency should be the standard by which we make decisions, transparency of the data. And I just wonder, are we entering a reality in which we need to be more thoughtful about how we approach reforms to scientific integrity, and what would that look like? And I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, I would just say that I think we need to be more deliberate and thoughtful about that indeed. And I've been thrilled and impressed with the work of my colleagues at Union of Concerned Scientists on this, because their approach to this is very thorough and now very paranoid, and I think rightfully so, based on what Kay has been saying. These assaults are now unprecedented, and we need to set up and establish defenses, guidelines, and precautions to make sure that should such an abomination of an administration ever happen again, or this one continue, that we protect both the scientists themselves and the data that we so need to make evidence-based policy.
I want to pile on.
Sure, pile on, and then we're going to turn to Q&A.
Just to say that we're talking a bit about the scientists who are inside the government, and I am a scientist who's outside the government. And I can't tell you how demoralizing it is to think that the work that I do wouldn't matter at all, that somehow science is not valued. And maybe it's okay for me because I'm a professor, I've had a great life, I've got a nice job, I could just teach. But the students who are training under me and the young professors that I know, it's crushing. It's just crushing to think, wow, there either may not be any money for me because the government might decide that studying the environment is somehow toxic, or if I do something really good, it may not matter because maybe no one cares in the policy world. Maybe they're not going to listen. And it's just demoralizing to think that what you do doesn't matter. And so I think for scientists, not only inside the government, but the entire scientific community that is supported by those federal dollars outside in the universities, it's really hard. It's hard to imagine being a young scientist right now.
Well, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we'll start with you in the front here.
Hi, thank you. Joan Michelson, Green Connections Radio. Thank you. This is amazing, and thank you, John. Two quick questions that tie together. One is we've heard about these screenings for loyalty among career employees, which are highly illegal, but illegal doesn't seem to matter at the moment. So I'd like you to address that. And the other is we have an election coming up. Are any of the candidates talking about these issues? Do any of them care about these issues? And are there any candidates that, if they get elected, would help, turn the Titanic away from the iceberg, pardon the triple entendre there?
Well, I can jump in on the screenings issue first. There have been reports from the beginning of this administration, actually during the transition of career employees being faced with certain various types of screenings, whether it's keywords, have you worked on climate change, things like that. And I believe unprecedented. Although I just had an interesting conversation with a long retired individual who was on an advisory board for DOI during the Reagan years, and he mentioned a conversation he had with James Watt, which was fascinating to me because he was just going to brief him on some of the things that were happening, and I think it was advisory issues around Park Service. And Watt strolled in and said, by the way, I'm going to get rid of anyone here who's not a good, qualified Republican and replace them with those who are. And if there aren't good, qualified Republicans, we'll put Republicans in, but we're not going to have, So it stunned me in that I've been thinking, well, this is unprecedented. But in some ways, it's not unprecedented. This has gone on behind closed doors before. This administration is being extremely open about it, as if there's no one guarding the henhouse. And I think that's the difference, is there's no oversight. So they're being very flagrant now about these kinds of screenings and loyalty tests. Now, they were at an energy, I think it was Department of Energy, where they were quickly told, whoa, dial back that screening process. That made a lot of news. But for the most part, they're feeling as though they can do this kind of thing with impunity. And I think that's the larger test for the democratic process.
Other questions? Yeah. Oh, yeah, we can come back to that question, yes.
Thank you to all the panel. Skip Roberts, SEIU retirees. I'm not a policy guy. I'm a campaign apparatchik. And, great talk by Congressman Tonko. That's great. I'm looking on who's sort of missing on our side. And I wonder, have your organizations reached out to the governors or gubernatorial candidates? Do governors have chief science advisors? Do big city mayors have them? Shouldn't there be a council of state governments, advisors? I mean, we need to try and get their voice here. And especially if you're a candidate in a deep red southern state, none of your people like the idea that a hurricane's going to stick around for 3 days. They have something they can use against an incumbent. I just think we need to sort of reach out, because we're locked out at the feds until 2021, hopefully no longer. We've got to get other people in the fight.
A great question. I will tell you there's an effort in Massachusetts right now to start up a scientific citizenship initiative to offer different levels of scientific advice at different levels of government and engaging scientists at different stages of their career. But it's still in very nascent form, but speaks to what you've articulated as a need. Others have thoughts? Yeah.
And I will say that through AAAS, we've been, assisting other states such as California, North Carolina, and others to get more scientific advice, accessible to state and local policymakers. Because after all, our scientists are everywhere in the country. But I will point out that, as has already been pointed out, there's no White House science advisor right now, and there's no dedicated congressional organization to provide science and technology advice to Congress. So there's still a lot that we can do in Washington, D.C., as well as the rest of the country, about making sure that decision makers, when they're making decisions, have access to the best available science and data. Of course, we can't control whether they will want to use it or not, but at least we can offer that service and that needed information.
I'll just add that I think most of the big city mayors now have excellent capacity and expertise on their staffs on particularly resilience and climate adaptation. And I was in Bonn for the climate talks last winter. In this case, not on the U.S. delegation. I was part of the Swedish delegation. And I was interested to see how the U.S. would be received. And the U.S. federal government bombed, of course. They were holding a coal event, I think. And there's more to say about that. But the headlines in Bonn were all about the U.S. stepping up via this thing called America's Pledge. And that was the mayors and the governors and the corporate leaders making greenhouse gas commitments. And that's because those entities all had very solid scientific expertise behind them, advising them. So I've been impressed with, and I met a lot of them in Bonn. They're really top-notch people. And I think talking about adaptation and resilience has led these leaders to realize what the costs are of not paying attention to the causes of climate change.
That's a great point as well, that sometimes the advisory apparatus when you go below the federal level happens more on topic and issue-oriented basis. When there's a technology issue, there's often a technology and business council advising a governor, but not necessarily, and climate change has become one of those issues, certainly at the municipal level. There's a question here. Yes, the glasses.
Hi, I'm Susan Sclafani, an educator, but one who's worried about this issue of next generation. You mentioned, both Joel and Deborah mentioned the impact on upcoming early career scientists. But I'm also very worried about the Trump administration's use of visas, student visas, to keep Chinese and other students out of the country because they might steal secrets from us. And I know that one of the top universities just told me that their physical science department would probably go out of existence if all Asian students were suddenly kept out of the country on student visas. So what can we do about that issue, which is the next generation of scientists coming up?
I can say something, but one thing I will say is the universities are getting involved in advocacy around this issue, including MIT, where I'm based, but Cambridge.
And AAAS as well, but the answer is I don't know. I don't know what to do.
I mean, that's when you
Yeah.
talk to your congressman.
Right.
But that is an essential issue. I mean, there are such strong links between all these immigration issues and the science enterprise here in the U.S. There's no question that's very important to unpack that and figure out how to answer that question.
We have just about 7 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get a few questions all the way in the back, and then we'll come back to this question here.
Thank you very much. Adam Ayton from E&D News. Good to see you guys. Thanks for the panel. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the way the Trump administration is, scrambling the scientific ecosystem. Earlier today, a report broke that the Interior Department is asking scientists to submit the titles for their presentations before going to conferences. And we've talked a little bit about restrictions to data sets and stuff like that, but I'm wondering if you could talk about the implications of restricting access just to the scientists themselves. Thank you.
Well, that's what the government-wide scientific integrity policy was intended to protect. It was intended to protect the ability of federal scientists to talk freely to the public, including journalists, about their work, about their science. Clearly, it's not working in every place as it should. I don't know. I don't know how to solve that problem. I hope collectively we do. But obviously points out that a policy is not enough. That policy requires implementation, oversight, enforcement if needed. And so that's what I don't know. Ideas, please.
And this is of course, this is going on, and it relates to the screening questions that have come up before. And also, it should be noted that for a federal scientist, the ability to go to conferences and network with your collaborators is absolutely essential to the job. So they're being hamstrung in many ways beyond just not being able to communicate their results to a wider audience. And I think it's apocryphal, and there needs to be, I don't know what the mechanisms are at this point to prevent that, other than a lot of people writing articles saying, this is BS, this is not what America's about. And I wish there was a mechanism within the federal government. I think it's called congressional oversight, but that's nowhere to be seen. So that is absolutely happening. I'm not surprised to hear about submitting titles and so on. They've certainly been edging toward that already by reviewing the grant proposals for words like climate change and things like that. So it's already affecting the science enterprise at DOI. This is just another ominous sign that they're really coming after the scientists and experts that upon which a good policy making depends.
Okay, Denise has a question. Yeah.
In post-Katrina New Orleans, Katrina happened in between the decennial census, and so for housing and population data, we had to fill the gap with citizen science and private sector data. I'm wondering, with regard to climate data, if there's a gap, what are the risks and opportunities for citizen science and private sector data to fill those gaps?
Well, I don't think we can do much about the satellites, but there have been some great observing systems based on citizen science. And in the Arctic, for example, there's what we call the Local Environmental Observers Network. And that is just an app for your phone. You can go out if you are a whaling captain, or you're out hunting, or you're a researcher and you happen to spot certain kinds of insects or species where they haven't normally been. That LEO, the LEO program, has been really helpful. So there are some, I would say, narrowly scoped gaps that can be filled with citizen science, and are already doing so thanks to technology. But of course, some of these larger systems, it's really hard to do. I don't know enough about
My view of that is that citizen science is a great complement to, and private sector science is a separate issue, but it's a way to ground truth and make ground relevant data that comes from satellites. So if you take the NASA GRACE satellites and you understand how the aquifer is being driven down, you still need science on water meters in California to understand, contextualize that for daily decisions, but it's not going to replace the public sector satellites. And of course, the danger with privatization of these critical public sources of infrastructure is that you never know how and whether the data will be shared publicly. And so I think while it's an important part of the ecosystem, we can't entirely rely on it.
Can I just mention traditional knowledge before the final? Because I think we forget about traditional knowledge, and not to go back to the Arctic, but these days, ice thickness and their ability to hunt is some of the best data we're getting on ice thickness around the near coastal areas in the Arctic is because hunters are falling through it. So some of these data, I think, that we get from traditional knowledge and how things are changing and have changed over the millennia, we can't ignore. And I think when we talk about science, we frequently forget that we have this very rich source of information that's sort of millennia-old citizen science.
Yeah, we don't want to devalue what the drivers know, but we also need to fix the roads,
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
So last question over here.
Hi, thank you. Olivia Young on behalf of the American Sustainable Business Council. I was just wondering if you could talk about proposed changes to the EPA, such as sentient science rules and changes to the cost-benefit analysis in terms of economic impact to businesses.
Ooh.
Yeah. So, well, the selective science policy, which, as Kay mentioned, restricts the use of scientific studies in the regulatory process that can't be completely transparent. This is ridiculous because most health studies have data that you just can't make publicly available. That's going to have an effect on, it turns out, and I think that the intent was to restrict science and allow companies greater influence over policy, but it turns out there are some unintended consequences for companies out there who actually rely on good science and expect regulations that reflect that. So there's more to that story. I would refer you to the Union of Concerned Scientists website on that.
And also just to point out that, of course, companies, including your companies, are providing data to federal agencies like EPA all the time, often on a confidential basis. And so it is a double-edged sword that potentially not being able to use company-provided data means that the EPA can't actually rule for regulatory relief if they can't rely on data that cannot be publicly disclosed. So potentially it is a double-edged sword, that whether you want EPA to regulate or to deregulate, you need solid research and data to do that.
And all companies crave certainty, right? So this seesaw of regulatory perturbations is pretty ridiculous. Some companies suffer because of it, and they don't have the benefits. It's just I would say the largest corporations that benefit from some of this deregulatory nonsense.
Unfortunately, we've come to our time, and I just want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank our extraordinary panelists for their insights and incredible stories. As you can see, the stakes are high, the threats are great, but there's a lot of really smart, committed people who care about this problem, including everyone in this room. And I have a good feeling about what we might do together. And so please keep in touch, and thank you so much for hosting this event.
Of the discussants earlier today. I think we have a lot of work to do, and we at CAP will continue that work. So join me in thanking the panelists again, and thanks all of you for joining us.